In this video, I'm just going to go over the most popular or most frequently used hooks or hooks in React, and I'm gonna specifically go over UseCallBack, UseContext, UseMemo, UseReducer, UseRef, and then I'm going to talk about difference between UseMemo and Memo, as well as UseCallBack. And I'm not going to go over UseEffect and UseState because I think these two are very, very common, very, very basics, and I think it is very, very easy to learn as well. So I'm not going to waste time to explain the details about them, but I will use UseEffect and UseState throughout the demonstration. Of course, there are other hooks that I didn't cover, but again, like I said, I'm just going to go over the most frequently used, the most popular hooks that you should know. And let's begin in this video. So let's talk about UseContext. So UseContext is from React hooks, and basically it can be able to pass data or methods to child components or children components without passing props to each level of component. So say we have a situation where we want to pass data from this app component right here down to this F component right here. Well, we can use Redux, but another solution we can do is we can basically just use the UseContext, and we can just pass this data to this UseContext, and this UseContext will be able to this component can be able to import this context and use it in its component. So here I'll show you an example where you can be able to pass data. So pass data to a UseContext, or you can pass a method to a context. So here you can see we have our parent component, which is called UseContext with a capital U. And then you can see we also have another component, which is a UseContext provider, which is another component. And basically, you can see that we have two children here. So one is a UseContext reset. The other one is a UseContext display. And then what we're trying to do here is we're trying to pass these contexts right here, so that these components can be able to use them. So here you can see inside the UseContext provider, we have a state. We also have a add or update the current state method, which we can be able to add our current number by 2. And we can also reset to update our current state down to 0. So every time when the user click on this button right here, it will be able to update our state. And then we also have our provider here. So to create a context, what's going to happen is, to pass value to this context, we have to create a number context, which is this context right here. And then .provider, we basically pass the value to this context. And all the children that are inside these context.provider can be able to access these values that are passed in. And basically what's happening is that here you can see these are the children, and we basically just pass that in our from our props to here. And then these children right here, you can see that to use the data that was being passed in, right, the value, we can be able to call this UseContext, pass in the number context, which is here right here, and it will give us the value. Once they give us the value, we can be able to display here. So you can see that functional component dot is number right here, so it will be like this. So you can see it will update. And then if we were to click on this reset button right here, you can also see that it works. So we can be able to pass methods. So you can see this reset here is a method, but we pass that in as a value. And then when user click on this button right here, it will reset this state. And then basically we can be able to use that as well. So basically that's what UseContext does. You can be able to pass methods, value to other components Obviously, if it's nearby, like if you know if we have a parent component here and then the child component is right here, then we can just pass data to the props, and then this component can be able to use that. But if we have our application is something like this, where we want to pass from the component A to data to component F or something like that, and then either we can use UseContext or use Redux or other MOBEX or state management tool. So either way works. So yeah, basically this is UseContext, and let's move on to the next one. So now I want to talk a little more about UseReducer. So UseReducer is another hook that is used for state management. So not statement, state management in React basically is alternative version or alternative option for using useState. So here you can see we have a couple reducers here. We have number reducer, which takes a current state as well as the action. Based on the action type, we're going to perform a certain action and then return the updated state. Then here we have another, same thing, we have another reducer, and it basically takes in a state as well as the action and then return a updated state. In our component, we have our component called UseReducer with a capital U. And in this reducer, or actually in this component, we bring in the UseReducer from the React hooks, and then we basically pass in the reducer, which in this case is a number reducer, as well as the initial state. In this case, the initial state is basically just a number with initial value of 0 for the initial state, and the data initial state is basically data and loading and error. But let's talk about this one first. This works exactly like a state. In useState, we have a state as well as a set state. Here we basically have our current state as well as the dispatch. This dispatch method basically takes in the object that we want to pass into the reducer. In this case, here you can see that we have a reducer, and then the second argument is the action. This action basically contains payload as well as the type. And based on the type of the action, we're going to perform a certain action. And we will use this payload. This payload contains the data that passed to this reducer so that we can be able to update our state so that we can return the updated state. This works very similar to Redux. And then here you can see that if we were to display what's inside our state. So inside here you can see we have num state. Num state has a value number, and then we can display that in our page. And if a user click on this button right here, which is add number, it has a type of add number right here, and then the data or the payload that we want to pass to the reducer is number plus 1. So if we call this method or trigger this method, we pass this data right here. It will pass to our reducer, and then here you can see we have a type, which is the add number, which is from this action types. These are the constant variables, so we put them in a separate files. And here you can see that we have our reducer, which have a type that is equal to add number. So when that action is passed to this reducer, it will go through here, and then it return this updated version of the state. Basically, this will concatenate our current state. So we pass in all the data that we have in our current state, and then we update the number to the current payload. And then here you can see that we also can be able to, so you can see we can be able to add number here, just like how we can use useState and setState in React hooks. And another thing that we can use UseReducer for is we can fetch data. Here you can see we have a use effect, and we first dispatch this action right here with type is equal to fetch data request, and this will pass to this reducer right here because we're using this dispatch data right here, not the dispatch num. So we basically try to set the loading is equal to true. Okay, so if I were to refresh this, initially it was, let's say if I make this to 2, and you can see that it has a loading and then the data appeared. So basically if the loading is true, it will display loading ... and then if loading is not true and then we found out that error is true or the error is not null, then we're going to display the error message. Otherwise we're going to display the data. Okay, so it's pretty simple. And then basically when we fetch the request, when we making the request call, if we have no error, it will basically display or dispatch this action right here, which has a type of fetch data success, and we pass in the response.data.title to this reducer's this case right here, and it returns the initial concatenate with the initial state as well as the data, which is going equal to the payload. And then here we have a catch error. So if we catch the error, we will basically pass the error as the payload, and then type is going to be fetch data error, which is exactly same as this one, which is going to pass the error and then make the loading is true. Loading is false because the initial state, the loading was false. If nothing happens, which is going to, by default, is going to return state. Here, basically, you can see that we can also reset. So this button right here, we can also reset this number, which I believe is this case right here, basically returns the initial state. So if I add a couple number right here, you can reset, and that's it. Okay, so this is basically UseReducer. How to use UseReducer is very, very similar to the way how they do it is really, really similar to Redux. But UseReducer is only for local state management. But if you're looking to learn something more like global state management, I will highly recommend to learn about Redux. So Redux is a state management tool for the entire application rather than just the current component. So I have a video on my channel where I talk about Redux, how to work with Redux with JavaScript, and then how to combine Redux with React. But Redux is not really geared towards, it's not only geared towards React, you can also use Redux with Angular, and Redux is not the only state management tool. There are also MOBEX, which I find it a lot easier to learn for beginners. Yeah, there's many state management tool, but I find Redux has a larger community and is well supported. So again, I have a video on my channel where I talk about how to work with Redux and basically how to use Redux, things like that. So be sure to check it out. So now I want to talk a little more about UseRef. So UseRef is another hook. Basically, it can be able to access DOM, and then it can also be able to store a mutable value, which we'll talk about in a second. And here you can see we have our component, which is a UseRef, which with a capital U. And then here you can see that we have our state, and we also have our button ref. This button ref variable can be able to access DOM elements by simply using this ref, and then by simply using ref, which equal to button ref inside the tag, in the button tag. And this will allow us to be able to access what's inside this DOM element right here. And then you can see that here we basically set the button ref.current.disable is equal to true. And now you can see this button right here is disabled. If I turn this into false, now you can see this is disabled. Sorry, the button is no longer disabled. And if I were to try to turn this to true. Now you can see this button is disabled. So this is one way we can use UseRef. The other way we can use UseRef is that we can be able to well, first thing first, we have to talk about something that what we cannot do. Because one thing that we cannot do is that we cannot like change the initial state. Here you can see we have our state here, and the initial value is 12, right? And we basically use v is equal to UseRef, and then we say ref is equal to v, and then we're trying to change the value of this input right here to 3 to 1, which we did, but it did not change the state value. So in the paragraph here, you can see that the state is right here, right? And it's 12, and that's 12 from here. And we did not change the state value. And if I were to maybe add a 1 here, you can see we changed the state value here, but it did not change the state value initially. So that's something that we have to, that I think is very, very important though. It does not change, if you change DOM here, it does not change the state, okay? And the other thing that I talked about is earlier is that we can be able to store a mutable value. And to store mutable value, what we can do is we can, first I create a variable called pre, so symbolize previous value is equal to UseRef. Initial value is 0, and then what's going to happen is that we can say prev.current is equal to state. Basically, we can store mutable value, manipulate the prev.current. Initially, it was 0, and then we manipulated the value to state. Every time we change the state, it will assign a new state to this pre.current, and then we can be able to mutate our data, just like how we mutate our variables. And what we can do is that we can, every time when the state change, it can also change the it can also be able to change our pre.current. It can also change that as well, and you can see that it can also persist the data as well. So persist the data. So we can be able to persist our previous state value, so that you can see that our state was, for example, 1 and then 31, and now you can see that it basically can be able to persist the previous data, even though our component was re-rendered. Now I want to talk about how to use Memo in our application. So here you can see we have an application. Our parent application is Memo with capital M, and here you can see we have two states. One state, basically this, when the user click on this H4 tag, this will change the state. And if a user click on this button right here, it will change state 2. And we basically pass state 2 onto to the child component props. And every time when we click on either those two HTML tags, it will re-render this component. And in a large scale application, we actually don't want to do this, because we don't want this component to re-render while this component re-render. So how can we do this? Well, first of all, let me show you what we have in our console. And you can see that here in our console, every time when this component re-render, it will print this string right here onto the console. So let's take a look at this in our website. So to start, here you can see that we have our application, and we have our H4 tag right here. So every time when we click on this or click on this, you can see that this string right here is displayed, right? So this string right here from here is being displayed. Okay, so every time I click here, or every time I click here, the components re-render, the parent component re-render, as well as the child component also re-rendered. So in this case, what we have to do is we can use Memo, which we can bring in from React. So to use Memo, we just bring in Memo right here, and then we just wrap around this component in Memo. Let me just show you. Usually we do this in a separate file, and we just wrap around at the end of the export.default, export default. So in this case, we can just wrap around the component itself. And then let's jump back to the browser. Now here you can see that we have our components rendered, and every time I click on the re-render child component, you can see that we have the string generated, so everything's working. And then if I click on the button or the h4 tag from the parent component, it only re-rendered the parent component and does not re-render the child component. And this is a good thing about using Memo. So now I want to talk about callback. So UseCallBack. So UseCallBack is very similar to Memo, but UseCallBack specifically memorize the functions. So here I'll show you an example. Here we have a child component as well as the parent component, which I copied the code, exactly the same code as the Memo, but I just changed the name. And then basically here, what you see here is that I just passed a function to this child component, and this child component has this change num function from the props, and then every time a user click on this this paragraph tags, it will trigger this method. And then what's going to happen is that it will actually re-render this component, and I will show you that in the browser. But basically, if we pass a method to this component to the props, it will actually re-render this component every time when user click on, like for example, this this button right here, which is actually set state from which is a local variable. We're changing a local variable here, or I should say the local state. So let's take a look at this in the browser. Here you can see we have an example, and every time when we click on here, you can see the child component re-rendered, and that's here right here. So every time when we click on this button right here, which is a local state, which is not part of this the data that's being passed in from the props. So Memo, we talked about what Memo is. Memo only re-render the component, re-render the child component if the props change. In this case, this prop right here didn't change, but this prop did, and let me show you why. The reason why this happened is because of the referential equality. So let's say here we define a couple variables here. We have const x is equal to 2. We have const y is equal to 2. And we check to see if x is equal to y, it will actually give us true. But let's say if we have z here, which is an object, and this object has a value variable, and this value variable has a value of 12. Now we have another variable a is equal to value, and this value has a value of 12 as well. And if we try to compare a is equal to z, it will give us false. And basically, we're using referential equality because every time when, like, basically, if we try to compare this object right here with this object right here, we basically check to see if this object right here, a, is allocating in the same position as this object right here. Basically, these objects are reference. They want to see if they're all pointing at the same object. In this case, they're not. So what we can do instead is we can say, okay, well, we want to get a is equal to z, and then we're going to check to see if a is equal to z. Now we have true. Okay, so because they're all pointing at the same the same place in the memory, so that's why it returns true. So same thing here. What we're trying to do is every time when it re-render this component, we actually create a brand new function. So if that's the case, then this, because the Memo only checked the referential equality, so it doesn't check to see if they actually have the same function, has the value, has same key or whatever. It only checks to see if they're actually at the same place in the memory. So in this case, because every time when we re-render this component, we are recreating another function. So in this case, we can use a UseCallBack, which memorize this function so that we don't have to re-render this component. So let's take a look at how to use callback. So now here, if we were to use callback method, we basically bring in use callback from React, and then we're just going to pass in the method for the first parameter. And then the second parameter is the list of dependencies. In this case, we don't have any. And here you can see that we have we basically store this use effect to a variable, and then we can be able to pass this memorize callback variable to this props. And this way, it will be able to memorize or cache this function so that we don't have to create this function when we re-render this component. So now, if we were to click on this button right now, it will not render this component. Okay, so let's take a look at this in our browser. So now here we have our browser here. So let's say if we were to click here or click here, you can see that nothing changed. But if I click here, you can see that we still can re-render this child component, but we cannot re-render the child component after we click here. Okay, so this is basically use callback. Got a UseMemo hooks. Basically, UseMemo does is that basically cache the value so that we don't have to compute that value every single time when we re-render the component. So here you can see we have a component that is called UseMemo with capital U. And here you can see that we have two state. So two use state, and we have a num and num2. So here we have two button and as well as a paragraph tag. Basically display the current state for the num and num2. And then every time user click on this button, it basically re-render this component and basically increment the previous value by 1. And here, when user click on this button, it basically increment the set num2 and basically increment the button 2 by 1. And every time when we increment this or click on this button, it will re-render this component, and therefore this method will be called over and over and over again because the button were called or the component was re-rendered. So every time the component was re-rendered, this method will be called. So let's take a look at this code. Let's take a look at this in our browser. So here you can see this is in our browser right now. We have a component here, and then basically every time we click on this re-render component button, you can see that this method is called, and this is actually inside the method, and you can see that inside the Fibonacci method, we actually print this string into our console. Okay, and then every time when we click, you can see that this is called. Doesn't matter which button we click, the component will be re-rendered. So we can, in this situation, we can use UseMemo to cache the value so that this method will not be called every single time. Basically, when the component first re-render, it will call this method. But when the component wants to re-render again, we don't have to call this method again. So let's take a look at how to do that. To change this in our code, what we have to do is basically just import UseMemo from React, and then basically we just pass in the method. So as well as the dependency. So it has two parameters. One is the function. Okay, it takes this function right here. Hold on. So you can see it takes this function right here as well as the dependency. So we can have just like how we use use effect, you can actually pass in dependencies. So every time when, for example, num2, so num2 changes, it will re-render the component, or every time when num changes, it re-render the component. So either way works, okay? Or we can have no dependency, and that's fine. So if we have no dependency, basically what it means is that every time when we re-render this component, this method will not be called again. Okay, so let's take a look at this in our code. So back to our code, you can see that we have our numbers here, and every time when we click on this or this, because this one right here has no dependency, so you can see that we have no dependency here. So every time when we click, nothing prints out in the console other than the first time. The first time it will re-render the component, but other than that, every time we want to re-render, we will not call this method. Okay. So now I want to talk a little more about differences between memo, UseCallBack, and UseMemo. So memo basically helps us to check to see if the props of that component, if the props of this child component are the same. If they are the same, then React can be able to reuse the memoized result by skipping the re-rendering. So if they are not the same, then this child component will be re-rendered because the props are not the same. But there could be a situation where we pass in a function, and because of the referential equality, we have to use something called UseCallBack to basically memoize the callback, to memoize the function. And this basically will also help us to prevent this component re-render by just help us to basically cache the callback or cache the function or memoize the callback. And this UseMemo basically returns a memoized value that is the result or the end value or the return value from a function. So you can see that here we have a Fibonacci function, a Fibonacci method. We pass in a number, we get a Fibonacci number. And then here you can see that every time when we re-render this component, we will call this function if we do not use this UseMemo. But if we use UseMemo, this will help us to cache this value so that we don't have to calculate this value every single time. And this will be very, very helpful if we're doing a heavy computation and we don't want to compute this every single time. We can just do this in our basically just cache the result and then be able to retrieve that. Be able to cache the result so that we don't have to re-render this component and call this method every time when we re-render this component. So hopefully you understand the differences between UseMemo, UseCallBack, and memo. Okay, so let's move on.